For those of you that I don't know, I'm Stefanos Geroulanos. I'm the director of the Remarque Institute, where I work with Sam Paul and Amy Nguyen and Lauren Lee, whom you probably saw downstairs. And it's a pleasure to finally be able to host Dan Edelstein at Remarque. Dan and I have known each other now like 17 years or something, have prepared work together, have co-edited together, and so, but this is the first time we get to do this here. Dan Edelstein is the William Bonsall Professor of French, and this is a strange construction, by courtesy of history and by courtesy of political science.
Very courteous.
Very courteous. At Stanford University, where he's also the faculty director of Stanford Introductory Studies. He's the author of 4 books. The Terror of Natural Right, which is the book that, really, frankly, made your name, exploded you onto the scene, with a fantastic rereading, especially of the period of the terror in the French Revolution. And then afterward of The Enlightenment, a genealogy, which concerned how the idea and narrative of an enlightenment emerged in the 1720s and what role it played both in the ancients and the moderns debate and in subsequent discussions. And then more recently, from 2018, the book on the spirit of rights, on the history of natural rights and human rights from the wars of religion through the end of the 18th century. He has edited a gazillion volumes, including one with Natasha Wheatley and myself, Power and Time. And we get to celebrate today his 4th book, The Revolution to Come, A History of an Idea from Thucydides to Lenin. Now, the book, as you probably know already, and as he will tell us a lot more about, tracks the idea of revolution from the ancient fear of uprisings through to the early modern replay of Polybius, a text that he also published in the Journal of the History of Ideas, and one of the few occasions where you go like, this is awesome, I get to actually do something amazing as an editor. And then on the place of revolution in relation to the emergence of an idea of historical progress in the 18th century, which is the real key moment in his account, and going on to ideas of permanent revolution, for example, all the way into the 20th century. And I'm going to leave this running joke on strawberries and cream to you. Now, to discuss the book with Dan, we have Judith Surkis, who is now a Remarque Fellow and a professor of history at Rutgers University. She's at Remarque this semester working on the intimate life of international law, children, and development after decolonization. And she's the author of 2 other books, Sex, Law, and Sovereignty in French Algeria, and Sexing the Citizen, Masculinity and Morality in France. And also with us is Sandipto Dasgupta, who's assistant professor of politics at the New School for Social Research. So I'm assuming like 1 or 2 buildings over. And thank you for being with us, and the author of Legalizing the Revolution, India and the Constitution of the Post-Colony, which came out last year. So the way we're going to do this is we'll have Dan talk to us for like 10, 15 minutes about the book, and then to be able to engage in conversation or respond to questions and comments by the 2 respondents. And then I'm going to open it up for discussion here. So yeah, please join me in welcoming Dan Edelstein.
Well, thanks so much, Steph. It's such a pleasure to be here with all of you. Thank you so much for coming. Thanks to Sam and Amy for all your help in getting here. I'm thinking, Steph, just all the different places in which working with you and with Natasha has actually shaped this book. You actually, I think, published one of the very first chapters of this book in the Scaffold of Sovereignty, and then there was the JHI, and then the volume we did with Natasha. Thanks also to my co-panelists. Looking forward, I think, to your questions. I actually didn't set out to write one of these big longue durée intellectual histories. I was hoping I could just write a book on the legacy of the French Revolution. And I really spent a long time trying to write that book. Actually, the first paper I gave based on this book, I think, was in 2011. And eventually realized that I couldn't tell this story without going all the way back to the Greeks and to Thucydides. And the reason was that I was trying to explain why it is that the French Revolution is the most important event in modern global history, and to do that, I had to sort of draw this contrast with the American Revolution, which is kind of this little parochial thing that happens on the fringes of the Atlantic world, and there was a lot that I sort of had and others had noticed. My colleague and mentor at Stanford, Keith Baker, has this great line that with the French Revolution, revolution goes from being a fact to becoming an act, meaning that beforehand, people could say, oh, there's a revolution going on. Whereas after, 1789, it was, we're in a revolution. What are we going to do? We're revolutionaries, a word that only, is invented with the French Revolution. And so there's a way in which 1789 sort of agenticizes, provides agency to the idea of revolution. But I was still struggling really to draw out this contrast, and I wanted to get away from sort of the whole political sociology approach that, with the contrast between political and social revolutions, which just seemed kind of both derivative and not really very explanatory to me. And so it was when I realized that really what was going on was not just a change in the meaning of revolution, but a new argument about the structure of history and time. And this is where the volume that Natasha, Steph, and I did really helped crystallize this idea that there was a sort of an indexing of ideas of revolution on ideas of history. And so the way this plays out in the book is to sort of show that the classical phobia of revolutions, which is probably most famously described by Thucydides, but then really is present in pretty much every classical thinker, is indexed to a certain vision of history as fairly repetitive, mercurial, cyclical, and not really arriving at any destination. And it's because history is, one damn thing after another, that revolutions are only seen as these sort of moments of disturbance, death, destruction, that aren't solving anything. Even if you have a negative, like if the oligarchs are oppressing the Democrats, as in, or actually in Corsair, it was the other way around, and you overthrow the regime, you're just buying time until you overthrow the regime again, and so that you get these cycles of revolution and violence. And it's never ending unless you can find a way to kind of freeze history. And so that's why actually half the book is, in fact, kind of more about constitutionalism, and this idea of the well-balanced constitution, which you start to see in the late Plato, that is really central in Aristotle, and that I sort of argue Polybius offers the canonical expression of this in book 6 of the Histories. Canonical because it's going to sort of be the way in which it's received in early modern Europe, but also because Polybius merges sort of the classical Greek categories of political thought with the ultimate example of classical history, which is the Roman Republic. And so it's that Polybian synthesis that is going to really, I think, be at the heart of a lot of constitutional thinking up until the American Revolution. So the point here being that in this classical tradition, revolution is the problem and political thought, and especially constitutional tinkering, is supposed to be the solution. If you can get a well-balanced constitution, the payoff is that you're postponing the inevitable decay of the state, you're postponing the revolution that will bring about its demise. Now, I will note I talk about sort of one exception to this story, which already was recognized in antiquity, which is that if you have a revolution against a tyrannical government and you're able to bring about a well-balanced constitution, that's considered a good outcome. So the locus classicus is like the expulsion of the Tarquins in Rome, bringing about a new kind of republican regime that balances the different social interests. That's the one good thing, and sort of the repeat version in the early modern times will be first the Glorious Revolution, and then second the American Revolution. But in this model, your goal as a constitutional framer or as a political theorist is basically how do we prevent revolutions from happening and how do we freeze history for as long as we can? It's a very sort of small c conservative view. And the reason why I think the French Revolution really does take us off into this whole other direction and becomes the template for modern revolutions that follow is because a new understanding of history had emerged in the 18th century, especially in France. And it is, what we would today sort of call the modern progressive vision of history, where we are no longer just going from one disaster to the next, but rather we are slowly on this glorious march towards reason and justice, which occasionally has setbacks, but will eventually lead us to this sort of perfect place where we don't even need politics anymore because we all just naturally agree on the rational thing to do. And this is sort of the strong version of the modern doctrine of historical progress. It gets elaborated in sort of in the wake of this sort of silly literary quarrel in France, the quarrel of the ancients and the moderns, but then with people like Turgot and later with Condorcet, and then of course eventually with Hegel and Marx, will become sort of this powerful new vision of history. And in this vision, suddenly revolution is no longer the thing you want to avoid because it's just synonymous with destruction and death, but it becomes almost as Marx would say, the locomotive of history. It's how you get from one phase of history to the higher phases closer towards reason and justice. So that's why ultimately I argue the American Revolution is really sort of the last of the classical revolutions, and the French is the first of the modern. But with all of the problems that this modern understanding of revolution brings, namely that it so happens that when we ascend in history, the natural consensus around what is reasonable and just doesn't simply materialize. And we still have differences of opinion, which is hard to frame or hard to square with this modern doctrine of history, which is ultimately very anti-pluralist, right? There can only be one reason. There can only be one justice. And so when you have competing versions of what is just, what is true, you have a problem. And I sort of show how that problem plays out first during the French Revolution and ultimately leads both to the sort of the forms of political violence that become synonymous with modern revolution. And I just want to emphasize that I'm not saying that they're more violent than classical revolutions. I mean, go back and read Thucydides on Corcyra. It's a really ugly, bloody mess. But it's rather that the forms of political violence in modern revolutions don't simply occur against the enemies, but also against the friends. So, think of the famous line by the Girondins, what's his last name again? Vaugirard, not Vaugirard. I'm blanking. It'll come back to me. But it's the line of, the revolution like Saturn devours its children. And so I think like this specificity of intra-revolutionary violence is actually a factor of this sort of modern historical vision of progress. And then in the later chapters, I also argue that that's actually what leads these revolutions to produce or even to sort of demand what I call a red Leviathan, a figure that will say once and for all, okay, enough of this infighting, this is what revolution means. And if you don't believe this, then this is what a counter-revolutionary looks like. And so whoever has the power, almost in a Schmittian way, to make that distinction between revolutionary and counter-revolutionary becomes this, authoritarian red Leviathan figure, which is sort of what we see in all of these modern cases. So that's a very rapid summary of the book. And maybe on that note, I will stop talking and hear what my friends on the panel have to say.
Thanks so much to Steph and the Remarque for inviting me to comment, and to Dan for writing this bracing and timely book. So I hope, Dan, that you'll forgive me if I say that this is in many ways a revolutionary book about revolution. Of course, I mean that as a good thing, and I hope that you'll take it as a compliment, even if, as you and your book teaches us, revolutions were not always seen in such a positive light. So writing with characteristic wit, the book literally begins with a joke. I thought you were going to tell it, but okay. We'll leave that. I save it. So now you'll all, pick up a copy right outside. And also, also a lot of erudition. Dan traces, as he's just told us, revolution's fortunes over the course of 2 millennia. A little more, in order to better understand how and when revolution went from being bad to good, and also modern. So in the process, he overturns, hence the revolutionary dimension, virtually all reigning explanatory paradigms. I mean, well, there are many, I don't know about all, Marxist, revisionist, Atlanticist accounts of the age of revolutions, and you do so by foregrounding the role of starkly contrasting ideas of history in the history of the idea of revolution itself. So put succinctly, the book thus turns around the question of how revolution went from being seen as a pox, a dangerously contagious ill, to a panacea. At once means an agent of historical progress, albeit with, as often as not, less than salutary effects. So in tracing this ambivalent history, the book also opens onto the question of what, if anything, is left, or maybe right, to the idea in our multiply fractured, cynical, and politically precarious present. So before fleshing out the arc of the book's arguments, which we'll see if there's time or if it's even really necessary, since Dan just gave us a good summary, I want to start with some overarching questions to frame the discussion. So the first is a meta-historical or methodological question, which I think resonates with some of the kind of big questions put on the table already by the edited volume on time and power that you both have already mentioned. Which is to say, or ask you to say more about how, in the process of writing this, how it's helped you to think more and more deeply about history and historical time while writing about ideas of history itself. So, in many ways, the book, is very much in keeping with our discipline's call to trace change over time. And you very effectively do so by asserting a moment of historical rupture in the idea of revolution itself on or about, I would say, like 1770, right? Right, which is to say in late Enlightenment France. So while you have a different object, your positing of this radical break really reminded me of Foucault's order of things. Both in terms of your chronology and in your mapping of a consequential epistemic shift in European thought. So I guess one question is to what extent that parallel makes sense to you, which that's a kind of first question. And then I guess I wonder to what extent you're similarly intimating that modern revolution's time has come. And that, like the face of Foucault's man, it has been and should go out to sea. Now, of course, I say this with a nod to the fact that the metaphor of being washed away by world historical tides is now not just a metaphor, and a future perfect revolution is not particularly well adapted to addressing the planetary crisis of extractive capitalism and climate change that we're currently facing. Not least, and this was the subject of Wendy Brown's JET lecture last spring, right? The environmentally damaged future will most definitely not be perfect. So I guess that's a pretty big first question. Second, and relatedly, the bloom has been off the revolutionary rose for some time, as you point out in your conclusion. So in your view, are we now, and have we already been operating in a different, call it postmodern, or what might you call it, I guess, regime of historicity? So AI evangelists and Steven Pinker aside, it seems pretty hard to consider our present as animated by an unalloyed faith in historical progress. On some level, this would seem, following your account, to actually be a good thing, at least for how we might conceive or reconceive of revolution. But that leaves open the question of what, if anything, of revolution's history is worth recollecting. So I have a brief account of the argument of the book, but I'm wondering if maybe we'll just, do you want to hear me? Sometimes it's interesting to hear how, okay. So, all right, so I'll try and move through this quickly. So your prompt and provocation is to show that in the classical worldview, anacyclosis, or what we now call revolution, was in fact a very bad thing. It definitely did not pave the way towards a better future. This was because, from the ancients' vantage, and I guess, one question here is like, does it make sense to think of it as an episteme? History did not unfold as a progressive narrative of human improvement and collective reconciliation. Without that faith, and I don't think we can still say our faith, right? In history's progressive movement, revolution was something to be studiously avoided with the help of political institutions and constitutions designed to keep it at bay. Most pointedly and prominently, the Polybian ideal of a division of sovereignty between three branches of government, an executive, legislative, and judicial function, were supposed to preserve the status quo, including its marked social inequalities and conflicts. Now, if the Polybian model sounds vaguely familiar, especially to the Americans in the audience, there's a reason. Tracing the translation of the word and concept of revolution over the course of centuries, I'm obviously skipping a lot here. Dan, you make a powerful case for the extent to which the leading lights of the American Revolution were in fact more Polybian than they were modern. They were, like the English, who they imitated, even while breaking from them, much more reconciled to social conflict and arguably preserving social inequality than the French would soon become. For recent critics of the evident limits of the US Constitution, this should come as no surprise. The French, meanwhile, were carried along by a new Enlightenment faith in historical progress, one that, for you, has an analogical rather than genealogical connection to religious faith. This was evidenced first in the domain of culture and mores, but then later in the unfolding of the political events of the revolution itself. So your account, this recenters late 18th century France as the birthplace of modern revolution. Revolutionaries embraced an attitude of the future perfect. Now, I do have a kind of question, secondary level question here about how this actually becomes a consensus, right? Because, given an otherwise governing assumption of the book, which you pointed to at the beginning, which seems to be the impossibility of completely eliminating difference, how is it that there's an argument here that there's a kind of consolidation, and everyone is kind of on board with this progressive view of history, right? So that everyone is, believes in the promise of of history, and hence, the revolution's eventual achievement of progressive ends, including all those good things like democracy, equality, and unity. But the problem being that this was used to justify anti-democratic and very violent means to arrive at those goals. The takeaway here is, as my mother likes to say, be careful what you wish for, especially if you assume that history is already moving in the right direction. Notably for Dan, the source of the problem was not the presumption of a unitary model of sovereignty, pace critics of Rousseau, but rather of progressivist historical thought, an idea that, to quote, public opinion would converge around a single rational and correct answer. So Dan then traces the paradoxically perverse effects of this future perfect reasoning, and I would add here that it's not just reasoning, because it is also a lot about feeling. How it, for better, but hence also for worse, lived on beyond 1789 through the liberal, if also authoritarian, regime of Napoleon, the 3 days of the July Revolution, and the liberal constitutional monarchy of Louis Philippe. The flaws of that deeply hypocritical regime exposed the social limits and arguably the real violence of liberalism. This was the context, of course, in which Marx and Engels were writing. They instantiate, as Dan explains it, that, quote, the greatest challenger to the liberal idea of revolution was history. namely inflationary hopes in the future. So those hopes would again soon be dashed, as anyone who teaches the history of 19th century France in the bloody Paris June days in 1848 and the eventual election of Napoleon's farcical nephew. Rather than giving up, however, Marx and eventually Lenin found new hope in the brief shining of the Paris Commune. Despite its ending very badly for the actual communards during the Bloody Week of May 1871, its imaginary lived on as a new and better model of direct democracy and popular sovereignty, one that operated at the level of the municipality rather than the state. The problem, as the Russian Revolution would make clear, was one of scale, right? How to scale this up. In the end, national and arguably international revolutions, even when they claimed to be based on local expressions of popular sovereignty, it needed a sovereign decider to interpret and implement the right way towards them. Importantly for Dan, this is a structural historical problem, not an ideological one. One born out in the ruins of diverse 20th century revolutions. So where does that leave us now? As I noted at the beginning, the bloom has been off the rose for some time. Revolution is now, as Dan points out in his conclusion, and at once banalized and vague slogan. And here, for those of you who are a certain age, you can cue the Nike ad from the 1980s. But arguably, also right now, subject to far-right appropriation in evidence all around us, as the Trump administration's theory of unitary executive and claim, at least according to Stephen Miller's slip 2 days ago of presidential plenary power, a clear and present danger. The fight against internal enemies, beginning with pro-Palestine activists and now purported drug gangs, trans people, and Antifa, is the thin edge of the wedge being used to hollow out the plebeian U.S. Constitution from within. What is to be done? Even if modernist faith in progress has created this pile of debris, pessimism and catastrophizing are clearly not much of an answer either. So what understanding of history should we adopt and write in order to chart a path towards a very uncertain future? And I guess this is like circling back to the first question that I'd asked. Is there a revolutionary history that is worth saving? And how to write it. So I'm curious to hear what you think, especially since history has been moving quickly in the direction of the silent, if increasingly less silent, right-wing revolution that you point to in your closing pages. I'll end with one brief proposition provocation, which is that it seems to me that it may be too hasty to consign all of revolutionary history to the dustbin. Right now, with the threat of the federal deployment of the National Guard bearing down on cities, the events and experiment of the Commune, including the anti-colonial revolt that it inspired in Algeria, seems very much worth calling. And here, I think, I can cite, and you are familiar with a whole bunch of political theorists and historians and cultural critics, Massimiliano Tomba, Kristen Ross, Carolyn Eichner, who've all returned to the Commune as a generative alternative political imaginary and as a touchstone for thinking about politics beyond the nation state, one that is both local and international. These recent histories, notably, do not confine the history and legacy of the Commune to Marx and Lenin's subsequent appropriations of it, as if those readings were its only and inevitable telos. So as we struggle on many of our campuses and in our municipalities, vote if you can on November 4th, to protect and produce a space not just for the freedom of thought, but also for practices of solidarity and community with our colleagues, students, and fellow citizens. This is more than just an academic exercise. And I could just say, I'm at Rutgers. Many of you may have seen the story of, the fact that we actually had an infrastructure of multiple signal chats, that connected us, allowed us to mobilize really, really quickly like in defense of them, and to like channel resources to them and like alert the, kind of union and the, the administration to what was happening. And like, that's like a kind of really crucial like infrastructure that is, anyway, so you can see like where I'm kind of going with this. So it's more than an academic exercise. It's happening here and now, and it is not a project for a perfect future. So perhaps not the explicit project of your book. It does seem that your critique of an excessive attachment to a progressive view of history actually opens up the possibility of just such a circling back, neither in an effort to preserve the status quo nor to find a lost golden age. Rather, it is the future, our current future's uncertainty, that creates the space and indeed demands a creative and experimental politics in and of the present, and the commune might just be one example of that.
So my line about the revolutionary book about revolution was taken already, so I can't use that anymore. But I would start by saying that I think, at least speaking for myself, these are the kind of books you aspire to write one day, because it doesn't just sort of intervene in an existing academic debate, narrow disciplinary debate, but it is an expansive, ambitious, and very erudite biography of an important concept. So one that you could just pick up and read because you're curious, rather than because you're compelled to do a literature review. So it's a book, in other words, to frequently underline, that its many insights incite ideas and further curiosities. And as you can see, that was exactly how my experience of the book went. But that is no way to offer a discussant comment, just freewheeling thoughts and insights. And so the iron law of this format and my own disciplinary background as a political theorist forces me to do some violence on the elegance of the book and boil it down to certain claims and then try to engage with them critically. So read this way, and again, with apologies, this book is not just about revolutions, but as I mentioned, it's the duality constitution revolution, which sort of roughly maps on to two other dualities in the book, which is that of ancient and modern, and compromise and conformity. And the first thread of that duality gets us to what we already call the Polybian model, where revolutions are about the decay of regimes, like natural life cycles, like seasons. The solution is to have a balanced constitution, one that achieves a compromise between contending classes, groups, to fend off disorder and decay for as long as possible, right? The second, more modern thread that Professor Edelstein attributes to the French Revolution correctly, thinks of revolution as a purposive, future-oriented activity to create a different, supposedly better world, right? It's the good Keith Baker line about being an act, not a fact. It draws from a particular theory of history as progress and a confidence in human activity to bring that about. So it doesn't happen, it's something you do. One, that in Hannah Arendt's words, confront us with the problem of new beginnings. Crucially, it is not about compromise, but certitude in the revolutionary project, which by its own logic needs to be won and unquestioned. This logic, Edelstein persistently argues, brings us to a terrifying internecine violence and the eventual dictatorship that has been the fate of so many modern revolutions, from Stalin to Khomeini. Now, this is what Professor Edelstein effectively calls the Red Leviathan. The one shining exception, partly because of periodization, I guess, to this was the American Revolution, right, which ended instead with a Polybian balanced constitution and a pluralist democracy, which has lasted very long, right? I haven't checked the news for the last few hours, but I'm guessing. And nevertheless, it's, of course, as we can all agree, it's not in the best of health. Despite the superb concluding chapter, which I will come back to later, one should read this book, as I mentioned, as a curious student of history, not instead as an analysis of the current moment. However, in the spirit of Benedetto Croce's motto that all history is contemporary history, allow me the liberty to probe some of the terms of the book from an unfortunate vantage point of our time. So Tocqueville remarked that Americans love change, but not revolution. This insight was extended famously by Louis Hartz to the thesis that what made the American Revolution exceptional was there was no existing feudal class to overcome, no ancient regime to abolish. The French Revolution, on the other hand, Tocqueville noted, was as much, if not more, about destruction of existing privileges as it was about achievement of new political rights. There was something, hierarchies, systems, and critically a class of powerful people to overcome. Which brings us to the concept of counter-revolution. Reinhard Koselleck wrote that it takes two to make a revolution, and counter-revolution is the other half of revolution. The concept was born through the Jacobin tendency to lump all their oppositions together as enemies of the revolution. However, its rhetorical abuse, as Professor Edelstein demonstrates so well in the book, does not elide the fact that it did point to a very real historical phenomenon. Revolutions always provoked a reaction from those whose powers it threatened. And in that sense, it was as purposive and as creative an act as revolution. It was not just about restoration. As citizens, as Joseph de Maistre famously exclaimed, this is how counter-revolutions are made. In other words, if revolutions are new beginnings, they are inevitably confronted by the defiant persistence of the old. A confrontation that ineluctably leads to massive violence. Rather than violence being innate to the logic of the revolution itself, Arno Meyer argued that the furies of revolutions are fueled primarily by the inevitable and unexceptional resistance of the forces and ideas opposed to it from home and abroad. So in other words, the old never exits stage left gradually and gracefully. If not fully overcome, it might and often have colonized the new. In the context of this country, perhaps the starkest example of that would be, as W. Du Bois argued in the Black Reconstruction, the aftermath of the Civil War, which Du Bois read as a social revolution. When the possible emergence of what he called the true democracy in America was extinguished by what he called the counter-revolution of property, leading to the long night of Jim Crow. According to Du Bois, then, change, to refer back to the Tocquevillian theme, was not possible without a revolution. Yet that hiatus between the no longer and no not yet, which is this great line I love from Merleau-Ponty, that hiatus gave the opportunity to the formerly enslaved to become citizens through their own political activity. As Sheldon Volin, political theorists, have argued that it was precisely in these exceptional moments, like revolutionary moments, that the people recognized themselves as self-instituting, self-determining subjects. While acknowledging the dangers inherent in this feeling of commonality that such moments might engender, Volin argued that without it, an atomized population cannot see itself as a demos. Professor Edelstein writes, and I'm going to quote, by opening up the future to a space to be colonized by a just society, the modern doctrinaires of progress encouraged their followers to value the world to come so highly that they were willing to accept the temporary suspension of democratic beliefs. At the level of description of certain historical events, there might be little to quarrel with it. But what about at the level of diagnosis? If we listen to, for example, Jason Frank is here, or Wendy Brown, who said was there, the horizon of this future just society or a world to come is what vivifies democratic politics in our moment. It offers necessary hope for people to think that political and civic participation matters, that they can affect the world that they inhabit. In a deeply insightful concluding chapter, Professor Edelstein thinks that through our current moments, as he thinks through this particular moment, in the terms he has developed in the book, and he speculates that we are witnessing an almost imperceptible change, a metabol, as he calls it, from democracy to dictatorship, a decay of regimes such that we might not even notice the revolution to come. I will end my comments by suggesting a different possibility for the sake of the discussion. Professor Edelstein notes that since the 1980s, revolution as a concept has lost almost all its appeal and purchase. As history ended or frozen, as was better used, there was no longer worlds to come. Politics became about ruling a void, while institutional outcomes became afflicted by what political scientists have euphemistically called a democracy deficit. Constitutional mechanisms for negotiated and deliberated change in the Polybian sense felt far too distant from the everyday life of a depoliticized population. In this context of the absence of a future, or to use the cultural critic Mark Fisher's word, a slow cancellation of the future, the discontents about precarity and inequality instead took the shape of an amorphous resentment of the present, the system, the swarm, or presently even the constitution, right? Now, could we wonder whether even the most well-balanced, long-lasting constitution requires the living hope for a just future, or maybe even say a revolutionary horizon, to be vibrant? Does a healthy democracy require the belief that people can indeed shape history for the better? The outcome of this hopeless anger is a regime today that incessantly proclaims reassertion and reinstitution of old hierarchies, whether of gender, ethnicity, or class, through the immense repressive and violent powers of a Leviathan, not red. It decries even the most minimal symbolic changes to a glorified old order. Could it be then that we are not witnessing an imperceivable revolution, as Professor Edelstein argues, but a counter-revolution that has arrived, proudly and publicly? The one-sided triumph of the already powerful, the already victorious, unrestrained, unchallenged, by even the faint threat of any revolution to come. Thank you.
I should take a few minutes and see how.
Okay, those were incredibly rich, and I might feel a little vertiginous. My mind is spinning in so many directions. Thank you so much, Judith and Sandipto. Well, I guess I'll just say two things. One, maybe I'll start with the kind of mea culpa. Remember, I presented, I feel like I might have one of the most dishonorable distinctions in the field of history, which is that I presented this book or ideas from this book twice at the Davis Center at Princeton at a 10-year interval. Which, to say how long it took me to write this. But last time I was there, Natasha, you took me to task for actually kind of straying from the central premise of the book we edited together, which is that historical regimes coexist and that they sort of affect each other, and it's not so much the case that one comes after the other, but you have these the moments of historical change are moments, and something that kind of both of you reflected on, where you sort of have competing versions, and it's sort of more in Steph's lovely word, chronosynosis.
I love your word.
And sort of like an ecology of different historical regimes. And I was kind of aware that, and Natasha made me very aware that I was kind of downplaying that and making it more of a story of sort of one after the other. And of course, that isn't the case. Like, as you brought up, like the counter-revolutionaries don't go away. Even in 1789, I mean, I think it's just like July 16th, the Comte d'Artois and the Comte de Provence, future Louis XVIII and Charles X, respectively, leave the country. And so the trickle of emigration begins right away. There's never a full consensus. I mean, I do think that there's sort of certain ideas of progress that start to become dominant. And then by the time we get to the 19th century, there's an interesting way in which progress has become sort of on the right, progress has sort of acquired the same value that revolution has on the left, meaning that everybody wants to wrap themselves around progress. no matter your political views, it sort of become the thing you have to attach yourself to. So, but it's certainly the case that there's sort of a more complicated story here around the different historical times that continue to exist. It's funny, I mean, I like The Order of Things, and it's probably a book, a bit like another book that I don't talk about too much, and I'll just put it out there now, that it is sort of in the back of my mind, and I've never really known what to do with it, which is Arendt's On Revolution. But I think actually the reason why this book might have a slight similar chronological structure to The Order of Things is that it's basically following the sort of standard French periodization. Right, Histoire moderne goes to 1789. Histoire contemporaine starts after that, and so I think that both Foucault and I are just, in a way, good students of the French lycée, and are, reflecting that periodization. I had a really hard time writing that last chapter. I've come, in my old age to realize that I'm a historian and I'm not a political theorist. I like writing the history of political thought, but I'm really not a political theorist. I have no idea what future political forms should take. Should we go back to the commune? Is that as a model? No clue. And so I'm not even going to speculate on that. The one thing I will say, though, is that if we're going to decide collectively that the plebeian model is defunct, right? This whole like well-balanced constitutional thing, checks and balances, clearly it's not working. I would say, well, is that an entirely fair assessment? And by that I mean that I think we have a tendency to forget that in the plebeian model, there are two parts. One is the tinkering of the Constitution, and he goes at great lengths in the early part of book 6 to talk about how do you distribute the various powers of government across these different offices to create a system where if one part of the government, say the consuls in his case, were to suddenly start to expand and claim plenary authority, that the other parts of the government, say the Senate, would be able to move into place and close it down. So that's sort of like the machinery of constitutionalism that Polybius describes, and that was very influential later. But in the end of book 6, he goes on about all of the Roman cultural traditions that are necessary to sustain this kind of constitutional model. And of course, that's what Pocock would famously sort of describe as sort of like the Machiavellian moment. It's not just when you're, and I think it's really a plebeian moment, but it's not just how do you arrange a constitution in the right way, it's how do you design a culture that is going to sustain, understand, and sort of provide almost the life force for this constitutional arrangement. And I think what's really happened today is that our culture, even if few of us are sort of gung-ho, strong defenders of the sort of modern theory of progress, Pache Pincus and people who lived down the street from me in Palo Alto, if that's sort of seen generally by I think most reasonable people as somewhat diluted, nonetheless, we are left with a kind of, I think we're all kind of weak moderns. You do kind of, like if you ask an average person on the street, if we go down to Fifth Avenue and say, excuse me, sir, in 100 years, what do you think that the world will look the same way as it does today? That nobody's going to say yes. Maybe they'll say, no, we'll all be underwater. But even if you sort of were able to say, let's imagine we can solve climate change, do you think that the world is going to look the same? I think we all sort of have been colonized by this modern imaginary. In which we just expect differences. Like if the new iPhone 17 didn't look different than the iPhone 15, like that would be strange, right? That's not how our order of things is supposed to work anymore. And so what I mean by all that is that what happens when culturally you have a system of beliefs and practices that is completely misaligned with the constitutional order that you have. The one option, I guess the modern option, is to just change that constitutional order. It's something new, maybe on the commune model. But another option would be to say, is it possible to think about our cultural, perhaps, deficits and work on those? And by that, I mean, I do think that one of the reasons why we're at this point where, if we can make jokes about how, is the Republic still there? Haven't checked the news recently, and we all get it, right? We all are very aware of the sort of the sense of crisis that we're in. But if we've gotten to that point, it's also that the very cultural preconditions that allow a system of well-balanced government to succeed have been lost. And by that, I mean, kind of basically, I think that there's just this fundamental crisis of pluralism, and not only in this country, but really in the modern Western world. And that the whole concept of a well-balanced government rests on a certain basic pluralistic belief that people are going to have different interests. Well, that's what Aristotle starts with. There's always going to be the wealthy few and the many poor. They're never going to see eye to eye. And we have to design a system that actually deals with that. Because otherwise you get revolution, you get stasis, and you get destruction. Even though that's a kind of, maybe that rubs against our egalitarian ethos, and it's not a sort of positive Rawlsian vision of pluralism, it is a kind of like basic pluralism still. You just have to accept, like, it's a brute fact that there's going to be social interests that are always going to collide, and we can't sort of expect that to go away. We have to deal with it, and so it becomes a pluralistic view. And I feel that there's a lot we could also be doing, again, on campuses, and probably a lot of people here are, tasked by university administrators to be working on this, to restore a kind of culture of pluralism, in which some of the fundamental cultural values that make democracy possible are recognized. Thinking of the great speech by Theseus in Euripides's The Suppliants, where there's this Theban sort of representative of a tyranny comes to like make fun of these silly Athenians and their assembly, and Theseus says, like, the value of a democracy is that we have multiple opinions and we hear them all, and whoever has the best ideas is able to say them. I'm not sure that we really even recognize that defense of democracy anymore. So before we ditch the Polybian model, I guess my plea would be, well, let's at least give it a fair chance.
Okay, cool. So why don't I'll go ahead and I'll hold a list of people with questions. So please raise your hand and I'll call on you when we get to time. Jason and Danielle.
Great. This was a really interesting discussion.
Oh, if you don't mind, please introduce yourself.
I'm Jason Frame from Cornell. I have not read the book yet, Dan, so this question is really coming, is based on what you gave in what you said in your opening remarks, and in some ways Sandipto asked the question that I had in a more eloquent way, but I really want to kind of push you to respond to one of the things that he said in his remarks, and it is about this figure of the Red Leviathan. Like, my understanding of your account of it is that the Red Leviathan is the product of a kind of logic, a discursive logic around revolution. It's not the typical story of the Rousseau, the terror that emerges from a collective will sort of story, the democratic totalitarianism, Cold War thing. But it's instead about this progressivist view of history and the idea that the justice or truth at the end of history is never going to be the outcome of any kind of consensus, but is itself going to be a site of fundamental conflict. And that's where the Red Leviathan has this Schmittian logic of like identifying who the friends are, who the enemies are, who the revolutionaries are, and who the counter-revolutionaries are. And when you, I think that's an accurate characterization, at least, of what you said in your opening remarks. But that did pose for me, I think, the question that it posed for Sandipto, which is a different understanding of the logic between revolution and counter-revolution. And it's a much more Arno Mayer kind of understanding of the logic between revolution and counter-revolution, which is to say the counter-revolution is not a discursive fantasy that is produced out of a logic. Like that seems, there's a kind of Claude Lefort version of that. There's a Pierre Rosanvallon version of that. There's a Francois Furet version of it. And I guess I'd want to hear more about how your version is distinct from those and how it would respond to the reality of counter-revolution. You know, that it's not just this discursive kind of artifact of a revolutionary logic, but it is just the social fact, basically, that those who have their privileges taken away and dismantled by a collective revolutionary movement do not go quietly into the night, but of course are going to fight to restore those lost privileges.
Well, maybe one by one, otherwise my brain gets muddled. Yeah, thanks for bringing that one up again and for reformulating it. I think what interests me, so, I mean, I guess my first answer is yes, of course, like, who would deny that there's real counter-revolutionary, right? They're the whites, they're the émigrés, right? This is always the case. But going back to like the distinction between French and American revolutions, right? There were plenty of loyalists, right, who were opposed to the American Revolution too. So that's not a modern development. You know, go back to Corsaira. I mean, the oligarchs and the Democrats were at each other's throats, right? One of them, you know, we could think of them as counter-revolutionary. But I think what changes once you get into the modern period and this term of counter-revolutionary emerges, which it does for the first time in France, is that it becomes an extraordinarily capacious category that not only incorporates those who are genuinely against the revolution, but also anybody who doesn't share your views about the revolution. And so that's really what, that's the part I'm talking about, not the genuine counter-revolutionaries, but the ways in which, you know, pretty much every French revolutionary goes to the guillotine being declared and called a counter-revolutionary. And then similarly, why does that logic keep on playing out, say, in the Soviet purges or during the Chinese Cultural Revolution? That's sort of where I'm getting out with the Red Leviathan, not so much like the earlier, you know, Trotsky being the war commissar and, you know, actually fighting the whites, but the way in which that logic then plays out intra-revolutionaries and becomes really the driver of so much revolutionary violence.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you very much. My name is Daniel Quiroga Marin, and I'm a House of Remarque postdoc here at the Institute. So if Judith talked about AI evangelists, I wanted to actually talk about evangelists. Because a big part of the claim you want to do is to try to show, maybe as a correction to other accounts that link too much Christian Minerianist thought to revolutionary thought, that these are two very different things. And I mean, I didn't get to go to the whole book also, but let's manage to the end of part one, where you really end on that, saying, well, there's this tradition of Enlightenment thought, and it's different from the Christians and their French beliefs. And I think that might be true for certain places, but to be honest, I wasn't entirely sure how true is that even for the French Revolution, and I wanted to press you more about that, because in a way, what you end up bringing up is kind of counter distinction between enlightenment and religion. No, it reminded me, Sandipto mentioned a Koselleck. I was thinking a lot about that kind of historiography. But I wonder, again, is that true even for the French Revolution? But most importantly, is that true for later accounts in the 20th century? So I know you finished with Lenin, and at that point, at the end of that part, you kind of stressed that certainly Mao's Red Guards are not coming from the Christian tradition. But I do think that in many places, I'm thinking about my own backyard, Latin America, of course, liberation theology is all about the mix of revolutionary and millenarist thought. Yeah. In that same vein, I was thinking that even in the Soviet case, a lot of the kind of revolutionary ferment has this tradition in Yiddish or Jewish tradition. So I want to pursue a little bit more further in that distinction between the religious, the Enlightenment kind of recipients of this revolutionary thoughts and practice.
Okay. As I have like 9 people,
okay.
I'm going to go ahead and say,
Okay.
Nancy, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, sure.
And why don't I, without this being a judgment on anybody who's actually spoken so far, why don't I say like about a minute maximum into a question and then a real question mark at the end. So far this has worked, but like let's just make sure.
Yeah. So I guess my question is actually how you would have written the book differently when thinking about the arguments of the book from the perspective of Europe's offshores, right? And the reason I ask that is like thinking a lot about French Revolution to secondary sort of level, the American Revolution. And I actually thought about the book in terms of like the Greek Revolution. And this question of actually maybe the transformation is not so much, I mean, there is clearly a transformation from revolution as a sort of descriptive, portrayal of some kind of reality happening into an act. But I also think that there's something else going on regarding like who gets to have a revolution, who gets to be a valid revolutionary. And so as much as, the question is, who is part of the whatever revolution you say, I think that it's not just like, I think part of the contemporaneousness of both models, right? Like the model that sees revolution in the positive sense and the model that sees revolution as a kind of empirical fact and perhaps even one to be avoided itself is reflected in the uneven distribution of judgment about who gets to be a valid revolutionary, right? And so it's not just saying like you're a counter-revolutionary, but also saying like you who sees yourself as a revolutionary are in fact a terrorist, for example, right? So I wonder what to do about that. I mean, speaking of Khomeini, right, like that revolution didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of like 1953 and Mossadegh being literally overthrown by the CIA. So it emerges out of these facts of real indignation and a sense of moral exhaustion. And the issue perhaps is not one of, domestic pluralism, but rather of what some people very, earnestly see as a hypocrisy between the pursuit for domestic pluralism and then our imperial projects elsewhere, whatever you want.
Okay. Great questions. Thanks. This is a kind of, I don't think I'm going to persuade everybody on this point, but here's what I'd say. I think that I would distinguish between three categories. There are clearly early modern revolutions that are driven by messianic beliefs. Those are like the ones I talk about in the book, like Münster, or even some of the the fifth monarchy men, 40. So there are no question, messianism and revolution are tied together. I don't see many traces of any messianic interest in 18th century France. The guys I'm looking at, Fontenelle, or especially the Abbé Saint-Pierre, who despite being an abbé is like as secular as they come. So to make that part work, you kind of have to suppose that there are just like these deep messianic transhistorical mental patterns that even though they're not appearing in any textual evidence are just there. And I guess that's not the kind of historian I am. Because I also feel like, well, then you can posit anything. So I don't really buy that. But then there's clearly like, I mean, Judith used a nice, I say it's analogous and not, I think.
I just was quoting you.
Oh, I said that. That was really well said. Can you read me back to myself? So
Parallel.
right, there's clearly like a certain parallel, and so therefore it's not to me at all surprising that later revolutionary movements would draw on this parallel. And again, I think there's kind of something like that going on in Iran with a kind of Shiism that is like obviously genealogically totally separate from this modern revolutionary model, but they actually line up pretty nicely. So, but I know that this is like an ongoing debate. And to Nancy's point, I mean, I think what I find is rather, I'm sure I disagree with you, or I'm not quite sure if, I mean, I don't really see a lot of policing of who gets to call themselves, right? And actually, it seems that that's like one of the first moves that people make is to claim the name revolutionary. Like even in, interestingly, recently in Hong Kong, there's that moment where a student sort of went from revolt to, no, actually, we've decided, we voted, and now it's a revolution. Now, of course, others like the state, the authorities are going to describe it otherwise, but sort of the availability of the term seems to be, in fact, open to anyone.
Take two questions in the back. So Yanni, and then two to the right. Yanni? I'm sorry, your turn.
I mean, this is a wonderfully ambitious project, and I admire very much even the effort. Was reading it. But I've noticed that in our conversations, particularly the three speakers, we begin with a book which ends in 1921, I guess, thereabouts. And then we somehow arrive almost by force of gravity into 2025, right? Which is interesting, right? And the last speaker, I think, is very fair to say, yeah, we're experiencing a really straightforward counter-revolution, for sure. Except that the book is really about events, right? And it's about the great events of historiography. It's that moment from 1789 when we begin to narrate our periodizations, no longer dynasties and wars and peace treaties, but revolutions, until we get to 1917, right? And then we go back to wars and peace treaties, right? Interesting in and of itself. But there is a question, Stefan. But that's events. And what we're experiencing right now isn't really events. Really not the great events, capital G, or revolutions, capital R, or counter-revolutions, capital C. What we're experiencing is something, should we take it back 80 years or so? The revolution was, the post-war recovery, Keynesian revolution, the welfare state, and all of that. And I would call that a revolution, but it's quiet, right? It doesn't happen in 1 year. It doesn't happen in 5 years. It happens over the course of until the 1970s. And then we have the 1970s onward, and I would say that's a very long-term, protracted counter-revolutions. And interestingly, counter-revolutions tend to last much longer than revolutions. But anyway, is it the right framework to use in order to understand our present predicament, right? Or were we better off with prison notebooks in all sorts of ways?
Thanks. My name's Christian Bailey. This takes more than a minute, just cut me off. Yeah, I was thinking about the process whereby the citizens or the revolutionaries become so enlightened they'll no longer need a state. It seems like the emergence of this Leviathan-like figure is a key moment. And I was thinking, how does the Leviathan turn these revolutionaries, or how does he, I guess it's a he, re-socialize the citizens so they become so enlightened? And it seems to me they become soldiers. Right? In the French Revolution, you have the levée en masse, and you become French revolutionaries by fighting. Same in the Soviet Union, right? The Russians, really, it becomes a reality when you talk about this agency, right? You gain agency by being a soldier. And I thought, this is kind of an unfair question, right? Because you've written on intellectual history, but the ideas don't really matter. To become a soldier is to do something, to feel fellow feeling because you're killing and risking your own life and so on. So I wonder whether that kind of doing is more important than the thinking. I mean, and just the comments that refer to Trump as maybe a revolutionary or a counter-revolutionary. I mean, who's the ideal citizen right now in Trumpian America? For me, it's somebody who's a member of the paramilitary organization, the ICE, or it's the National Guard in the cities. They're the good guys right now, right? Because they're doing that stuff. So I wonder whether the military plays a bigger role in this story than maybe I've heard so.
I kind of generally agree with Walter Scott that you shouldn't write about things that are less than 60 years old. But I was a bit obliged in this book to take it up to the present. So I do have, even though it technically ends with Lenin, it does have a last chapter that goes rapidly through the 20th century and ventures to offer a few thoughts on our contemporary moment. So it's my fault. But yeah, I'm always reminded of the great line. It wasn't Deng Xiaoping, but in 1970 when Nixon goes to China. Yeah, and asks Xu Enlai, yeah. So what do you think about the French Revolution? And Xu Enlai answers, well, it's too soon to say. Of course, he was actually talking about 1968, but it was too good to let go. So generally, yeah, I would agree. And on the soldiers, yeah, there's something to that, and you could almost say, like in the Chinese Cultural Revolution, like how do you show you're a revolutionary? We just like have to go beat somebody up who might actually agree with you on everything, but you call them a counter-revolutionary. Like that's sort of like the insane absurdity of the Cultural Revolution. But I would still say ideas matter, actually, because that's the only way you can define what you're doing is at that point by attacking somebody else. So it's kind of a reductio ad violencia, but it's still driven by ideas, I would say.
Yes, so my name is Paul, I come from Athens, Greece. But unfortunately, I'm much younger than Thucydides. So it's a very simple question. What would be the term revolution, Thucydides? And I'm saying this because revolution means a kind of return to the same. Well, in modern Greek at least, revolution is translated as epanastasis, a repositioning. It does not refer to a return to the same. Based on this kind of distinction, these questions that have been posed can become better illuminated in a way, because, for example, revolution, counter-revolution is a repositioning either in this direction or in that direction, things like that. So just please, for let exact translation for revolution.
in history at Columbia. It's a version of your question that's been circulating, but I wanted to hear you say a little more about how you're dealing with the kind of the question of causality and the role of ideas and versus politics or whatever because obviously you're making a very, it sounds like, I haven't read the book yet, but it sounds like you're making a very strong argument for the centrality of ideas in this. But what I found very interesting is that the figures that you highlight are obviously not the ones we usually think of. Like Turgot, Abbé Saint-Pierre, Condorcet were the three that you mentioned, versus of course Rousseau or someone like that. So how are you kind of tracing the question of causality there? I mean, it seems like obviously someone like Rousseau was so important for Robespierre. So, and then back to this question of politics and ideas. I think it's somewhat related to what Jason was trying to get to. Is it because they have a logic of history that is already impregnating them that they're trying to push through to the end? Or is it because they find themselves in another Schmittian situation, a state of emergency, right? Where there's internal war, external war, and this has to kind of accelerates the process, the revolutionary process. Like, is this ideas or is this facts on the ground, right? And you could say, you could say that, yes, unfortunately it happens in Russia, it happens, in France, it happens in China, but there is something about the process of revolution that creates these kinds of acceleration of politics where you have to move fast, right? So is this kind of predetermined at the ideological level, or is this a result of?
I'm curious about this too, because you kind of wiggle out of it in the introductions. Sort of like really kind of trying to negotiate it, and I really wonder what you do think. Or if that was like a kind of piece of an intro to go through.
Okay, great. So Thucydides uses stasis. So it's interesting that the modern Greek term still has the stasis, right? Is it anastasis? So it still sort of that concept is present in there, though the what's interesting in Greek, in ancient Greek, is that there's a separate term for the regime change, which was metabole. I don't know if that's still used in modern Greek. And so, and I think, one of the interesting things that happens is the collapse of those two terms, revolution, when Polybius actually gets translated into Latin and then Romance languages. Yeah, ideas, causality, state of emergency. So the sort of causal story I'm trying to trace is that there's a intellectual history of the idea of progress that starts with these guys like Fontenelle, Abbé Saint-Pierre, Turgot. And interestingly, it's not picked up right away. People think the Abbé Saint-Pierre is crazy. Moitié philosophe, moitié fou, I think is how Voltaire describes him. But then as the 18th century goes on, you start to find this idea disseminating more and more. So Voltaire actually converts and starts talking about it all the time. In the Mercier's L'an 2440, the year 2440, the title itself, as the French would say, is Tout un programme. And has already this same, both the idea of progress and the changing meaning of revolution. So really what I'm saying is that by 1789, the word revolution has already acquired a very different meaning. And I think you see this right away in the speeches that the deputies are giving at the Estates General and at the National Assembly. The way they talk about revolution completely reflects sort of this cultural work that's happened in the previous decades. And as for the state of emergency, the good old Jacobin thesis, just teasing.
I mean, the reason I would resist it is that I don't think anything changes once they're in trouble. You know, it's the exact same patterns of the way in which they define revolution, that they're situating themselves against each other, and sort of the logics that they're unfolding in 1793 or even in 1794, when like everyone's at their throats, have not changed. So actually, I think that to me is the real weakness of the thèse des circonstances. It's that, well, what's the evidence that the circonstances have changed the way people are talking, thinking, or acting about revolution? So
I have Steve, I have Alex, and I want to ask a question, and tell me if we don't have enough time.
Yeah, I am wondering a little bit more about the emancipatory dimension comes attached to the work, because in search of what you call the transhistorical, I would also say the transgeographical, it seems to me that it's actually more important. And I wonder if you could say something about it, taking in light also that large parts of what you call, I think, the Red Leviathan are not in Europe, but they're in Asia, Africa, and South America. Okay? So how did they perceive it? And I would say that, you know, I mean, you touch a little bit about those when you talk about the I Ching and the term there. And I have a very long and tedious analogical argument to make about this particular character that would support your argument, but actually say that, you know, the point is that this was misread by a Japanese person who was seeking to was translating a book about the French Revolution and was looking for a word for revolution, and then dug the term for the I Ching. And in fact, when Sun Yat-sen was introduced with this term, and as many other Chinese future revolutionaries in Japan, they rejected it. They say it doesn't mean revolution. It means something completely different. And they were right. But of course, they were wrong. Because, you know, once this Japanese author uses this, you know, basically the entire package that you're talking about comes into it. Right. Okay. Yeah. I would also add that, and this goes back to the book where I include the chapter on revolutions in China, is that there is an interesting anomaly. The word revolution in China is the most used in Chinese political discourses in the 20th century. But never a revolution, always revolutionary that, revolutionary army. If you look at how many events the Chinese actually assigned the term revolution in Chinese, Keming or Kakome in Japanese, you'd find only two. Only two. 1911 was actually landed as first of all labeled as uprising, the way the Bolshevik revolution. Only later in hindsight, they call it revolution. 49 was not a revolution, was liberation. And the only event in Chinese history, in 20th century Chinese history, in which they consciously move in to say this is a revolution, even before they started, is the Cultural Revolution, which is not about regime change, interestingly enough. Okay. Well, I said no psychological tediousness, but I did.
Okay, Alex?
Hi, Alexander Seven. I teach history at CUNY. So my question is about the constitutional aspect of your argument. You said this became central to the book. So I was thinking a little bit about the American and French cases, which seems like a central comparison. You know, for all of its Polybian qualities, I mean, I'm thinking of the work of Lazare or more recent work of Rana. You know, the Constitution the Constitution that the founders create is kind of noteworthy for the fact that it is impossible to change. The Lazare book that I'm thinking of is called The Frozen Constitution. So how well balanced is this in the end? And it doesn't feel like it's just a feature of our contemporary landscape, so much as the contemporary landscape puts it under immense pressure, since there is not the viable route to change the Constitution that way. Something about this Constitution from the get-go is very, very difficult to change. Then you have the French Revolution and the way the Constitution works there. There you have multiple constitutions. Constitutions are made and enacted, but then suspended. Some are enacted in 1793 that never really get put into practice. They're constantly making constitutions in a way. And it also made me think of his point a little about sort of Robespierre's actual justifications for the terror, which are, yeah, there's the thing about who is the revolutionary or not, who is counter-revolutionary, but that is partly related to this idea in his debate with Desmoulins and the Vieux Cordelier that he's shutting down. You know, they're like, you're violating the Constitution. He's like, I have to violate the Constitution in order to save the revolution. You're going to protect the Constitution at the expense of the revolution, then we'll have no liberties at all, right? So I realize that's kind of old debate, but I just thought, I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about the role that constitution making or constitution defending plays in these two cases, how that relates to your argument.
So gee, that was great. I love the sinological stuff. I think, yeah, there would be a lot to say about sort of the connection between liberty and revolution. And I just want to sort of acknowledge that and not try to do an impromptu short speech on it, because I probably wouldn't do that very well. But I think you're right that it's something that would need to be drawn out more. And it's really interesting to think about. I think, Alex, to your point, I mean, I would almost say it's a miracle we have Article 5 at all. Because in the classical paradigm, the last thing you want to do is change the Constitution. You know, like what makes Lycurgus so great is that the Spartans had the same Constitution for 700 years. What makes the Roman Republic so great is that the Constitution, even though they did have to get there by stages, they started in Polybius's time, it was, you know, it was said, don't mess with the Constitution, right? That's the whole goal. So I think that it was almost a modern move to include Article 5 and to allow a potential to change the Constitution. I also don't think that they would necessarily have realized how impossible it was going to become. There are other changes that account for that. I think with the French, it's not so much that the French, I think, you know, they end up kind of changing their constitution like they change their shirts, right? It's and that's not just that they're, I think, sort of figured out the sort of modern constitutionalism. It's that ultimately, especially like with the Jacobins, I mean, that actually doesn't really feel like anything that has much value to them. I mean, that's what's so amazing to me. And I still don't understand why French Revolution historians don't make more of this, is that once they suspend the 1793 Constitution, and they literally suspended it, almost within weeks, they're already saying, yeah, we're going to have to scrap it. We're going to need something new, and it's going to be this sort of natural constitution. They're already kind of thinking in these end of history terms. And so if that's your goal, it's sort of like saying, yeah, the Soviets wrote a really great 1936 constitution. It gives, I think as Stalin said at the time, the most rights to most citizens. It's like, who cares, right? Like, it was like purely this sort of exercise that had no real meaning to it. And I think that, you know, that's going to change in the French case. Like under the Directory, they actually, I think, do make a real attempt to sort of come up with a constitution that's going to deal with their problems. And Andrew Janeshill wrote a great book on that, but it fails. And so, yeah, I guess I'll stop there.
Let me give it a try. Let me give it a try to a question that has to do with the periodization that you construct and this relationship between revolution and progress that you talked about before. So Judith thought you were Foucault returned. I thought there was a lot of causalicans. Like the schema is all built in like between the mid-18th and the mid-19th century, and from there on it kind of plays itself out. So the first part of my question was something like the metaphorical or aesthetic uses of revolution seem to disappear after a point. They're part of the 20th century you don't want to over discuss. And they're the part that I really want to be coming from. I wondered, though you create this contrast between revolution and progress, not a hard one, but there is, after a point in the 19th century, a sort of distinction between the two, a different kind of dynamic in relation, a dynamic of the actor in relation to progress. I wondered first, what happens, don't you end up reconstructing a scenario whereby revolutions are basically like the things that happen generally on the left, with a kind of little parenthesis around Khomeini, but we don't talk about anything else as a revolution except as a counter-revolutionary action. I find it very hard to think about 1917 and then not to think about fascism and Nazism again as a revolution. And you could say the term is not that, but in many cases that you've discussed earlier, that's not exactly quite the term. And there are all sorts of relations to managing progress, freezing history, doing this sort of thing. The freezing history part was incredibly useful too. I'm curious what happens if you are going to have this negotiation of the 19th century around, let's say, revolution and progress, which I think is an important contribution of the book. Isn't there a way in which you kind of deny any possibility of thinking of revolutions from the right, except in terms completely overdetermined by history re-reified in the account this year? That where all the terms have been set up in this march from 1917, with a distinction or the distance from the American Revolution. Can I take Tommy as well as the last question before we go? Sorry, that was a little long.
Yeah,
but
that
Tommy.
actually feeds off very well because I was thinking about where would you find the distinction between revolution and civil war? I think for me, thinking about the implications of, let's say, the US Civil War, maybe that has revolutionary results or consequences. However, it's interesting just to think that both sides, in a way, didn't necessarily claim, I think, the revolutionary mantle. In the sense that actually, if anything, both of them, into a way, I think of, the idea of preserving or maintaining the nation, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's just curious, just in terms of how else do you think about, in terms of, I guess, conflicts that have the revolutionary implications, but very much aside, oh, this is not necessarily the moniker or discursive framing of revolution, but more specifically to freeze time in the sense that, like, oh, to maintain the status quo. And just kind of, those type of choices in that sense.
Thanks. Ending on really easy questions. I mean, I will confess that I think I have a cop-out in the book sort of saying that, there's a version of this book that will include fascism, Nazism as another chapter. And I didn't really have it in me to write that chapter. And I guess it did feel, I totally agree with you. And I think I do say that in the book that you can't really understand fascism or Nazism without 1917. And that they're very much right-wing response. And they're very different than like earlier reactionary modes. They're revolutionary. I have no problem saying they're revolutionary. I do feel, and maybe this is, I won't die on this hill, but I do feel that to write that history of like right-wing revolutions in the 20th century, it felt like I would have to, I do feel like ultimately it's sort of coming from a different angle and then intersecting the revolutionary history. And I wouldn't have felt comfortable just talking about it there. It would have meant sort of excavating that whole earlier part. And that's sort of why I copped out to, that's a different project. And write it, which isn't to say it's not essential. It's not part of this story. And then for, revolutions and civil war, there's that great piece by David Armitage, titled Every Revolution is a Civil War. And I think that you're right to call attention to that. I guess I'd just make two quick points on that. One is, I would say that actually 1860s in this country was a highly revolutionary moment, especially in the South, actually. Like they're reenacting a lot of the original revolutionary discourse, even like declarations of independence that are very much modeled on the 1776. And when American historians like to get on their high horse and say how, well, at least the American Revolution, like you didn't have violence of like the French Revolution, the Civil War. It's like, well, like 1860s is just the unfinished business of the American Revolution. So you really have to sort of think of that all together. Right. But also I would say that, the stuff I'm interested in ultimately, I don't think can all be reduced to civil war. The book actually doesn't really end in 1921, even aside the last chapter, because I'm more interested in what happens in Russia after the death of Lenin. And because I think that's one of the really fascinating moments that just to me at least reveals something about how revolutionary authority gets established. And so that isn't actually a story about civil war. Like the Civil War is over at that point. It's more a story of how do you get a revolutionary regime modeled on the Paris Commune, and maybe there's other ways of doing it, but that leads to this sort of red Leviathan-like.
Well, thank you, Dan. Thank you, Sandipto.